Hi, I'm Pastor Kerry. Before we get started, there are a few things I want to encourage you to have on hand. First, I want to encourage you to have a set of the sermon notes, and if you don't already have them, you can go to the link that's right down below the video. It'll take you to a place where you can print a set of the sermon notes for yourself. I also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You'll want to have some bread or a cracker, you'll want to have some juice or some wine, and if you don't have juice or wine, really any beverage would suffice. But you'll want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes, when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion with you. So, if you need any of those things, then I would encourage you to pause the video right now. Get whatever you need. Once everything is ready, then go ahead and resume the playback. So today as we get started, I want to read you a speech. And whether you are watching this by yourself, or if you're watching this with another person or several people, what I want to have you do is as soon as you think you know who originally gave this speech, I just want you to say their name out loud. So, here is the speech. We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all people. For space science, like nuclear science and all technology, has no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force for good or ill depends on man, and only if the United States occupies a position of preeminence can we help decide whether this new ocean will be a sea of peace or a new terrifying theater of war. I do not say that we should go or will go unprotected against the hostile misuse of space any more than we go unprotected against the hostile misuse of land or sea. But I do say that space can be explored and mastered without feeding the fires of war, without repeating the mistakes that man has made in extending his writ around this globe of ours. So that is the end of the first paragraph. At this point, do you think you know who gave the speech originally? If you're not quite sure yet, I'm pretty sure that you'll know after I read the final two paragraphs. You're going to know in just a minute here. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why 35 years ago fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. So, do you know by now? This speech, of course, was originally given by John F. Kennedy. And this served to pretty much jumpstart the space race to the moon. Not that we hadn't already been involved in a space race with Russia. We certainly had, and I should say the Soviet Union. Back then it wasn't Russia, it was the Soviet Union. We had been involved with the space race with the Soviet Union for at least a decade at that point, if not longer. And at that point, honestly, we were losing the space race. But John F. Kennedy gave this speech, and then lo and behold, by the end of the decade, just barely, but by the end of the decade, we arrived safely on the moon. We won the space race. We, in fact, did what John F. Kennedy had given this speech about. Sadly and tragically, John F. Kennedy didn't live to see that day. But one of the things that I really admire about this speech, and I think most people would say that they admire about this speech, is that he didn't say this is going to be easy. He said this is going to be difficult. He said the reason that we're doing this is because it is difficult, but because it serves a greater purpose, because it serves all of humanity. This is considered to be one of the great speeches in the history of the United States. I would contend it's one of the great speeches in the history of the world. And the reason that I wanted to start with this today is because in the lectionary gospel readings we're going to be taking a look at today, Jesus is going to have some very challenging words for the disciples. And much like John F. Kennedy in this speech said, this isn't going to be easy. This is going to be incredibly difficult. I want you to know that going into it. Jesus is going to say to the disciples in these passages that we're going to take a look at today, this isn't going to be easy. This is going to be incredibly difficult. So, without any further ado, let's take a look at what Jesus had to say to the disciples. We're going to be taking a look at lectionary passages for several weeks. Actually, we're going to be taking a look at the lectionary passages for June 18th, June 25th, and July 2nd. These are all from Matthew chapter 10. This is an abridged version of Matthew chapter 10. So, starting with Matthew chapter 10, verse 1. Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles or enter into any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and be flogged in the synagogues. On my account you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time you will be given what to say. For it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. So do not be afraid of them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the daylight. What is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the roofs. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. May God bless the reading of the incredibly challenging word. So, like I said, just like JFK gave a speech and said, it is not going to be easy, it is going to be difficult. As Jesus was getting ready to send out the 12, he said to them, in no uncertain terms in this passage, it is not going to be easy, it is going to be incredibly difficult. There is way more to unpack in this passage than we can possibly unpack in the next 11 minutes, and so I'm not even going to try to unpack it all. But what I want to do is I do want to point out a number of things in this passage to you. I do want to take a little bit closer look at it. After we take a little bit closer look at this passage as a whole, then what I want to do is I want to focus on 3 of the instructions, just 3 of the instructions out of the dozen or score of instructions that Jesus has for the disciples in this passage. So, this is taking place in Matthew chapter 10. So, this is fairly early in Jesus' ministry. And at this point, Jesus has chosen the 12 disciples, and right at the outset of their ministry and Jesus' ministry, he is getting ready to send them out. And one of the first things that, interestingly, Jesus says to him is he says, don't go to the Gentiles. Don't go to the Samaritans. And of course, you know that the Gentiles were the non-Jews. Anybody who wasn't Jewish was considered to be Gentile. And the Samaritans were the half-Jews, half-Gentiles. And Jesus is saying, don't go to those who are half-Jewish and half-non-Jewish. He says, instead, go to the lost sheep of Israel. He's saying, go to your fellow Hebrews. Go and take this message to your fellow Jews. And he says, as you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. In other words, go and proclaim the gospel. Go and proclaim the good news. And he says you're going to perform all sorts of miracles as you do so. Then we get down to verse 16, and Jesus says something very interesting. He says, I'm sending you out like a bunch of sheep into a bunch of wolves. He says, because I'm sending you like a bunch of sheep amongst a bunch of wolves, he says, I need you to be as shrewd as snakes, but as innocent as doves. And we're going to come back and we're going to talk more about that here in just a couple minutes. He says, look, there are going to be bad things that are going to happen to you. You need to understand that right up front. He says, you are going to be whipped, and it is not going to be fun. He says at the end of this third paragraph, he says in verses 19 and 20, he says, there are going to be times where they're going to expect you to speak up for yourself. He says, and when those moments come, know this, God is going to speak through you. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about that in a couple minutes. He says, look, you are going to be incredibly unpopular because of your belief in me, because you are my disciples. He says, but whoever stands firm to the end, they will be saved. And Jesus, at the start of verse 26, says that's why you shouldn't be afraid of them. Even though they are going to be the ones that are arresting you, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be putting you through the ringer, essentially, he says, you don't have to be afraid of them. He says, eventually, everyone is going to know what you've been proclaiming, this gospel, this good news. Eventually, everyone is going to know that what you've proclaimed is true. And then, as we get down towards the bottom of the passage, Jesus says something that is certainly one of the most challenging things that we have in the Gospels from Jesus. He says, don't suppose that I've come to bring let me try that again. He says, don't suppose that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. He says, I've come to turn a man against his father, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, a daughter against her mother. And then Jesus says in verse 37, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. All right, I do want to unpack that a little bit, because we read that and we go, wow. I mean, what's Jesus trying to say there? That seems so different than so many of the things that Jesus has to say in the rest of the Gospels. And again, we have to remember the context. Jesus is sending out the disciples for the very first time, and he's trying to help them to understand this is not going to be easy. This is going to be incredibly difficult. Jesus is essentially psyching them up and saying, I need you to be prepared for the worst. And he says, this good news, even though it is good news, it is going to cause conflict. And as we look back over the last 2,000 years of human history, we know that Jesus was right about that. That the gospel, even though it is good news, it has also been the source of a great deal of conflict. He says, even within your own families, this may cause stress. And I think that that was even more true 2,000 years ago, probably more true 2,000 years ago, than it is for us today. And that's probably another discussion for another time. But trust me, that's probably something that was more true for them than it is for us, although there are certainly going to be exceptions among us in this day and age as well. And then at the end of the passage, Jesus says, you need to love me more than you love your father and mother. You need to love me more than you love your children. And I know that you're thinking to yourself, but I love my father and my mother with every fiber of my being. I love my children with every fiber of my being, or at least hopefully. Hopefully that's how you feel about your father and mother. Hopefully that's how you feel about your children. And the point that Jesus was trying to make is that the greatest love that you may feel, that we need to love Jesus even more than that. That's the point. Jesus isn't saying that we shouldn't love our father, that we shouldn't love our mother, that we shouldn't love our children, that we shouldn't love our grandchildren, that we shouldn't love our siblings. The point that Jesus is trying to make is that whatever is the greatest love we know, that we need to love Jesus even more than that. And the passage concludes with Jesus saying, whoever does not take up their cross and follow me isn't worthy of me. And I think that you understand that 2,000 years ago, when someone was carrying a cross, what did that mean? Well, 2,000 years ago, when someone was carrying a cross, it meant that they were about to die. And Jesus is saying, you need to be willing to die for me, for this gospel, for this good news. And Jesus concludes by saying, whoever finds their life is going to lose it. Whoever loses their life for me and for the sake of this gospel, they are the ones that are going to find their life. So again, just like JFK said to the American people back at the start of the 1960s, said, we're going to undertake this mission, and it is not going to be easy, but that's why we're undertaking this mission, because it's for the good of all of humanity. That's essentially like what Jesus was saying here to the disciples. It is not going to be easy at all, but the reason that you're doing this is for the good of all of humanity. And now, very quickly, there are so many instructions that Jesus has for the disciples in this passage, and I can't possibly touch on all of them. Let's focus on 3 of them. And the first lesson that I want to focus on is this. The first instruction is this. As disciples, we must be cautious, yet kind. As disciples, we must be cautious, yet kind. Back in verse 16, Jesus said, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves, therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. So Jesus is saying on one side of the coin, you have to be shrewd, you have to be wise, you have to be careful, you have to be clever. But on the other side of the coin, you have to be innocent. You have to be gracious. You have to be loving. You have to be kind. And that is a source of tremendous tension, I think, for most of us, if not all of us, today. Because as Jesus' modern day disciples, we want to be kind. We want to be loving. We want to be gracious. But at the same time, we have to realize that if you're kind, if you're loving, if you're gracious, if you're generous, that there are some who are going to take advantage of that. And so that is the tension that we live with. I can tell you firsthand, as a pastor, I live with that tension practically every day. As a pastor, practically every day, I get asked, hey, pastor, could you help me with this? Or could you do that? And listen, I would love to help literally every single person that asks me to help them. Seriously, I would. But I also have to realize that there are some people that try to take advantage of me as a pastor, that try to take advantage of my church, that try to take advantage of my church members. I've seen that happen too, where people don't come to my church and try to talk to me and say, hey, pastor, could you help me with some gas money or this or that? Instead, they'll go and find one of the members of this church and ask them for gas money or whatever. And it's tough. We want to be kind, we want to be loving, and we want to be gracious. But at the same time, we can't let people take advantage of us. That's what Jesus was saying in this passage. That's one of the toughest things, one of truly the toughest things for us as Christians, is to be kind and yet to be cautious at the same time. Be kind like an innocent dove, yet be cautious like a shrewd snake. And if any of you out there have mastered the art of that, please give me a call, because I'm still trying to figure it out, and I've been a pastor for over 3 decades now. So that is the first instruction. The second instruction, and I need to hurry now, is this. As disciples, we must trust the Spirit to give us the right words at the right time. As disciples, we must trust the Spirit to give us the right words at the right time. So Jesus said, when you go out, there are going to be people looking to put you under arrest, and they're going to be asking you to explain yourself. And Jesus says, don't worry about it. Jesus said, when they ask you to explain yourself, Jesus says in verses 19 and 20, that in those moments, that God is going to speak through you. And I wonder if you have ever had that experience. I can tell you that there is a specific occasion in my life when I absolutely positively had that experience. And it's a long story, and I am out of time, and I need to start moving this towards our time of communion together before the sermon video cuts off. But I can tell you that it was just a little over 2 decades ago where I was kind of caught between a big group of people that was unhappy with a small group of people. The small group of people was unhappy with this big group of people. I'm kind of stuck in between. And at some point, someone who was frustrated said, "Well, Kerry, what do you think?" And here's the truth. The truth is, I wanted to say that the big group of people was absolutely right. But the problem is that if I had said that, it would not have moved this situation towards resolution. Honestly, it probably would have made the situation worse. And even though, with every fiber of my being, I wanted to say, I agree with this big group, I paused and I waited, and the craziest thing happened. Some words came out of my mouth, and the words that came out of my mouth at that moment were not what I was thinking, were not what I particularly wanted to say, and yet they happened to be exactly the right words in that moment. And actually, after these two groups, a large group and a small group, had been arguing with each other in a pretty unpleasant conversation for over an hour, after I said those words, suddenly the whole thing turned around and it moved to a resolution. And again, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back because those were not my words, I promise you. If I had said what I wanted to say, it just would have gone from bad to worse. If we trust God, there will be times when God gives us the words. Okay, very quickly, the final instruction that I want to focus on is this. As disciples, we must count the cost. As disciples, we must count the cost. And my goodness, I could preach another entire 20-minute sermon just on this instruction alone. That's what Jesus has been saying through this entire passage. Through this entire passage, Jesus has been saying, good, you want to be a disciple? That's great. You want to proclaim the good news? That's wonderful. Be aware that it's not going to be easy. It is going to be hard. And there are going to be times when they are going to want to arrest you. They're going to want to whip you. There are going to be times when it's going to cause conflict within your own family, with the people that you love the most. You need to be willing to die for this. So, friends, we need to be willing to count the cost. And my guess is that if you're watching this video, the reason you're watching this video is because you decided a long time ago that you wanted to be a disciple. You wanted to be a follower of Jesus Christ. You wanted to be a Christian. And a long time ago, you decided that you were willing to count the cost. And so in many ways, I realize I've been preaching to the choir. And obviously, Jesus was one who put his money where his mouth was, because Jesus carried the cross for us. And every time we gather around the table, we honor the sacrifice that Jesus made. I'm going to run out of time, but go ahead and grab your communion elements, and I'll grab mine. And I would simply remind you of Jesus' words recorded by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where Jesus said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And this is my blood, shed for you.